Hello, friends, and welcome to Inside Indie, the podcast about the ins and outs of self-publishing a book. I'm your host, Holly Dunn. I'm a book cover designer, and today we are talking with a book blurb specialist, Jessie CUNNIFFE. Jessie has so much insight about short-form writing and how to write for your audience to really draw them in and hopefully get them to purchase your book. So today we're talking all about the blurb writing process, the do's and don'ts and ins and outs. Unfortunately, the video for this one did not record, so if you're watching on YouTube, I do apologise for the lack of visuals, but I do recommend going and watching Jessie on Instagram. She has some wonderful reels on there, and she has a lovely smiley face as well. I'm just sorry that you don't get to see it in this. So, without further ado, here is Jessie.
Are you a blurb writer? Are you a blurber, a blurbist? What's the correct term?
Who knows? I think blurb writer is kind of what most people tend to go for. I kind of like blurbist now. That has not occurred to me.
I quite like that too.
I'm in a funny kind of in between where I'm like a blurb writer and I'm also a book blurb coach because I also teach authors how to write their own blurbs. So I tend to just go with professional blurb writer and book blurb coach, which is a mouthful and a half. But I can't think of a simpler way to do it. And quite honestly, when I tell people I'm a blurb writer, I end up having to explain it anyway if I'm not in a bookish circle because most people just don't know what a book blurb is. So yeah, there's no nice, simple, concise little job title for me. It's long and complicated and weird.
Yeah, it amazes me. I have the same thing when people, I say to someone, oh, I'm a book cover designer. That doesn't necessarily compute into like an image of a person doing a particular thing. So
they just think it magically appears.
Yeah, it's interesting how like, people within the book world think about it, and then outside, it's an interesting thing to explain.
It is. It's super weird, and I think people often don't think through the processes of how we get things like books. And it's like you've been in like the self-publishing kind of world bubble for a while, you sort of don't think about these things, but then you've got someone like, what's an ISBN and how do I get my book on Amazon, all these kinds of things, and you're like, wow, it's actually like this really full-on involved process. And people don't
it really
people just pick up a book in the bookstore and they're like, it's a book, cool, it exists. They don't think about the cover designer or the blurb writer, who I didn't think about blurb writers before I became one. So it's just it's something that a lot of people don't necessarily think of consciously, I think.
No, and I must say I didn't really think of blurb writing as being something separate to being a writer or being a marketer. So we'll get more into what your role actually involves and what a book blurb actually is. But first I wanted to kind of ask you about how you got into this, because I know you were a music teacher.
Yes.
So how does one go from music teacher to book blurbist?
By accident, I think is probably the most concise answer. So I've always been a writer. It was kind of like a toss up between, do I do a journalism degree or a music degree when I was like, 17, 18. And I went with music because I just thought, look, I'd love to get to further my music training. I actually had no idea I was going to become a teacher at that point. I just knew that I loved music and that's what I wanted to do. I'm a classically trained pianist. So I went forward with that and I was like, I can always do writing on the side. I can always do that. So I made music I was a music teacher from age 17. I'm 31 now. And I've only not been a music teacher for 6 months. It's something I've always done, even part-time while I was doing more and more blurb stuff. And it's only in the last 6 months that I was like, okay, I don't have time for both. So it's strange. Like, this is the longest I've been out of the classroom. But essentially what happened was in 2020, I happened to have a contract for 4 days a week instead of 5 days a week. It was nothing to do with the pandemic. I was super lucky through the pandemic. I had a stable income. Teaching was super weird from home, but I still had a great deal of kind of flexibility. And yeah, in 2020, I just had 4 days a week and I was like, well, this is the time for me to do more writing. So for the last 10 years, I'd been writing for the Sydney Morning Herald as a music critic. Weirdly enough, my music review word count was 200 words. So I'd spent a long time writing 200 word things, which is ding, 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 the same length as a blurb, give or take. And it taught me a lot about explaining art, I suppose, like being able to kind of interpret art for people who have not yet encountered it and explain it to them so they can decide whether they might like to dive in, and also doing that in a really, really tight word count. So it's bizarrely related. At the time, I just thought I was going to become a music journalist, and that's where I was going to sort of head. So I did a bit more writing for the Herald. I had like every Wednesday off from school. So do some more writing for the Herald, but then I was like, I just want to sort of go and do some freelance stuff. And it was just the strangest sort of constellation of events where my boyfriend, who's a linguist, had just self-published some books on Latin. And I'd kind of watched him go through the process of getting it on Amazon, and he wrote his own book description, and he's a very like no fuss person. There was no drama. I just kind of like watched him, and it was like he didn't find the blurb particularly hard or the whole kind of uploading process. He's just kind of like, I don't know, he's just remarkable. And so I was watching him do all of this, and I was like, oh, that's an interesting piece in the process, writing the book description. I didn't want to get involved in any kind of huge writing projects. I wanted to write something short and kind of get experience with lots of different clients. So I was just like, I wonder if people would pay me to write their book description, their book blurb. And I genuinely had zero idea like how much authors hate writing blurbs. Genuinely zero. This was not a clever like business idea where I was like, hey, authors hate this, I'm going to tap into this market. It was genuinely like, that's a short thing. I like writing short things. I'm a short form writer. I'll try this. And I went on fiverr.com and I put up a gig, and I think it sat there for a month or two. And then I got like two orders. And then they both gave me 5-star reviews, and I got a few more. And then it was kind of, because I mean, Fiverr's quite a competitive marketplace. There's lots of people writing book blurbs on Fiverr. But within, I think it was that first month or two, Fiverr actually approached me and said, we really like your gig. Your first reviews are really strong. We want to like assign a mentor to you. So they assigned me like, I can't remember how long the partnership was. I think it's like for 3 or 4 months. They assigned this guy to me who basically helped me optimize my gigs, provided extra support. They boosted my listing to the very top and was kind of like, you know, up and coming, whatever. Like it all just happened so fast. And from there, things snowballed. And I was still working 4 days as a teacher with, you know, with marking and things like that. It's more like a 5-day job. And then I was staying up till midnight writing blurbs. I was writing, I don't know, 11, 12 blurbs a week, like just in every genre imaginable. I was charging $20 a blurb because I had no idea what I was doing. And I'm like, I'm just learning this. And on Fiverr, everything's pretty cheap, and which is great. Like for authors on a tight budget, there's lots of great providers on Fiverr who is, you know, super affordable. But I ended up writing the equivalent of 1 blurb every day for 7 months. And it was just like the best internship I could have possibly had. I took every job. I wrote every type of blurb. And what I started to notice was that people were saying things to me like, oh, you're the 5th blurb writer I've been to, or you're the 3rd blurb writer, or like, I've tried to write this so many times on my own and I couldn't get it right. You're the first person who's gotten it right. And I was like, really? Like, to me, this was not a hard thing. Although I could fully appreciate how it might be difficult once you've written a book to step back and try to kind of sell it. But I just was kind of like, whoa, I didn't really, like, there was this outpouring of relief basically. And I had lots of repeat clients, and it just kind of blew up. And I was kind of like, wow, there's really a need here. But by the end of 2020, I had been told by my school that they wanted me on full time. I was going to be a year advisor, all this exciting stuff. So I was like, right, well, I'm committing to this career. So I can't keep writing blurbs like this. I can't work all hours. I'll make a course. And I just made this course to kind of like, I'm a teacher, that's what I do. So I was like, I'll just figure out what it is that I actually do with every blurb, and I'll try to make it so that it works for authors specifically. So the process in my course differs slightly from what I personally do, because I put in exercises there specifically to help authors step outside of their book, etc., etc. And then like nothing happened for like 6 months. I put it on Instagram. I was busy working my school job. I had stopped writing on Fiverr. And then one person on Instagram bought my course when I had like under 80 followers. I remember that day I was super depressed, scrolling through Instagram like, nothing's ever going to happen. I shouldn't have made a course. This is so dumb. Authors don't want to write their own blurbs. And then this photo came up on my feed, and I was like, that's my course on someone else's computer. what am I looking at? And this author had posted about me and she was like, oh, I've just done the introductory unit. This is super helpful. Like, it's really worth it. She happened to have a strong following and it all snowballed from there. And by the end of 2021, I was back into writing blurbs one-to-one after a year away from it. And I was like, yeah, this is what I need to do. So from then on, it was just full steam ahead. The strangest, most kind of convoluted story to get here. But everything just kind of gradually fell into place.
Yeah, that's fascinating. Wow, and the connection between your music journalism and the blurb writing, that's so interesting. I hadn't really thought of it like that, but that's very true. It's the same kind of reason for writing.
Yes. Yeah, you want to get people interested in the albums that you're writing about. And music is even stranger to write about because it's a whole other medium. And I wasn't using my like theoretical knowledge and things like that because you're writing for people who are reading over their morning coffee. They're not interested in the flat and seventh in,
Exactly.
They don't want that. They want to know how the music feels and how it's going to make them feel. And yeah, it was honestly, there were a couple of editors, during my time there, and they were just always so fantastic. And I ended up writing some features and things as well, but I loved the short form so much. I also I had a music criticism job with another magazine briefly where my reviews were 75 words, and that was for a full album. And that was just, I loved it. My editor thought that I was crazy. He was like, I can't believe you're actually like enjoying this. I've given you, it was a 4-wheel drive magazine that decided to have album reviews, which is why they were so short. And I was just like, yes, I can do this. And it didn't actually last that long because they decided that 4-wheel drivers weren't really that interested in music reviews. But when I left, my editor was like, I was always in awe of how you fit a whole album into 75 words. And it was honestly the hardest writing I've ever done in my life, but so satisfying. So I'm that freak who loves to like work with the tightest word limits. That to me is so much more exciting than writing 50,000 words. To me, like I would genuinely struggle because I'm just so used to working within really, really tight constraints. I would probably work one sentence at a time and freak out as I get up to a few thousand words. It's much, much harder for me to write anything longer than that because I'm just trying to say the most in the fewest words humanly possible.
That is fascinating. So that brings us quite nicely to the next question, which is, what is a blurb? You've clearly said that it's a short piece of writing, but beyond that, imagine that I don't even know what a book is. What on earth is a blurb?
So a blurb is the book description on the back cover of the book that essentially sells it to your readers. It's also the same as your Amazon description. So when people click into Amazon, beside your book is the description. Some people ask whether they have to do something like a different description on Amazon to what they put on their back cover. Once upon a time, Amazon descriptions used to be a bit longer than the back cover blurb. So the back cover blurb used to be about 200, and then the Amazon descriptions would kind of go up to 250. That is not the case anymore. Like short and sweet is definitely best. So I tend to put the same on both. The only difference in Amazon is that I'll include like a call to action, sort of reminding them to scroll up, click buy now, that kind of thing. Because on Amazon, when they read the whole blurb, they scroll down to the bottom, they have to scroll back up to buy. And it's kind of the stupidest, most simple thing. But that little reminder at the bottom is really helpful. But obviously you don't need that on the physical back cover of the book.
I'm just imagining on the back of the book having, take this up to the checkout now.
I have actually seen books with something kind of similar, and I mean, it's not to say you can't have a call to action on a physical cover. I think it's just a little stranger. I see it most often perhaps in nonfiction books. It's kind of like, buy this book to start your new life today kind of thing. That seems to be, but for fiction, not so much. You've just got to end on an exciting note. But yeah, it's essentially what we call sales copy. It is the little piece of advertising. And I mean, books didn't always have blurbs. And I think one thing that's sort of interesting to note is that the word blurb has changed meaning over the years as well. So once upon a time, the first blurbs were just endorsements, which people still whinge about. Every so often I see a reel on Instagram where someone's like, can we just have proper book descriptions instead of endorsements from people, famous people? So publishers, especially trad publishers, will often use both. But once upon a time, it was just books were basically sold by word of mouth. You'd have these endorsements on them, and they were called the blurbs. And occasionally, if you're working with agents or trad publishers who've been in the industry for, let's say, 20 years, if they say blurb, like we need to get your book blurbed, they're probably talking about reaching out to someone for a quote. But in the indie world and some trad published, like the kind of more recent usage of it, the book blurb is the book description. And that's where a lot of confusion lies. And so it's always good to kind of clarify with whoever you're talking to, because blurb has this weird little nebulous kind of history where it's just good to make sure you're both on the same page.
I think because it can be used as a verb as well. Like one author might ask another, "Or can you blurb my book?" And that might mean like a little review that might go on the front cover, even.
Yes, exactly. So you will hear people kind of using it interchangeably, but book description magic was too much of a mouthful for my business name.
Yeah.
So book blurb magic it is.
and I guess you've got to think about keywords, what people are going to be searching for. Speaking of keywords, is that something you're thinking about when you're writing the blurb? Because obviously it's not so important for physical books necessarily, although people might just scan the blurb and be looking for keywords. But for search, that's now something that is a big part of blurb writing, I would imagine.
Yeah, it's an interesting one. I suppose the writer in me probably comes out. I don't believe in sacrificing readability for keywords. And that's something that you will actually see quite a lot of on Amazon. There are lots of terrible, terrible blurbs on Amazon. If you want to go find terrible blurbs, just go search through and you will find a whole bunch of, like, there are good ones out there, but it's a bit of a minefield. And you'll notice that people do things like just keyword dump. And especially in title and subtitle, which is not my domain, but I'm just noticing that people doing that on Amazon, they'll cram in, book talk, sensation, romance of such and such and such, like everything into the title and subtitle. I don't have any strong opinions on that. I think sometimes it gets a bit chaotic and looks a bit try hard, but maybe it's working for searches. Insofar as the blurb is concerned, we do know that Amazon searches the blurb for keywords as well. So if someone types in their keywords into their search, we know that the blurb is part of what Amazon is scanning. But at the end of the day, your title, your subtitle, your keywords and categories that you put into Amazon KDP should be doing the heavy lifting so that your blurb can actually just shine as a piece of sales copy. I, of course, always want to make sure I'm using vocab, and that includes keywords that are going to appeal to the ideal reader, especially with nonfiction. If there's any kind of technical terms and things that readers are going to be searching for, I do really work hard to make sure that has a place in the blurb. But more often than not, it's easy because it should be in there. It's an obvious part of the content. But my absolute number one priority is always readability, because if they're not going to read all the way through the blurb, we can't sell them on the book. And if you're going to give them, paragraphs of keywords, they're not going to read it. And it's only if they're kind of desperate for something, like, I don't know, a how-to manual, like, oh, okay, that addresses, the technical things I need to know, that they're going to buy based off that kind of blurb. Otherwise, you want it to be a beautiful piece of writing that they can't help but read, and that propels them to action. So that's always my main focus when writing blurbs. But a lot of keywords do find their way in organically, basically, through that process. I just never allow them to trump readability in the process.
That makes a lot of sense. I'm thinking of terms like dark academia, for instance, that isn't a genre or subgenre that necessarily has a category on Amazon, but it might be something that people search for. And I've seen it. I've seen that one particularly added into blurbs in a couple of places that I'm not sure how well it works or not, but you can see why it's been added, because that's obviously something that people are searching for and wanting.
Yes.
Even though, like, the rest of the text should make it perfectly obvious that this is a piece of dark academia. It's set at a university, and there's a murder, and there's a small group of friends, and all those kind of tropes that we would look for. But for the searchability, they've sort of have to put it in there. Maybe in like a little summary at the end, this is a dark academia sensation
Yes.
from TikTok or whatever.
Yeah. And I mean, I don't have anything against those sort of little descriptors at the bottom of the blurb, so long as they're short and so long as they're necessary. So if you and this is because I find that's often where authors will go wrong. They'll try to cram or they'll try to hype the book too much, and readers are really wary of hype. Hype doesn't kind of ring true for most people. So you can have this really great blurb and then it ends with, the thrilling page turner of the season. It's like, well, do I know that? Like, if the New York Times isn't saying that, am I going to believe you? Is it just going to sound like hype and you're trying to, force me to buy your book kind of thing? So, but there's nothing wrong with saying, I mean, I do it a lot for romance because there's a lot of kind of points that we want to hit for romance. For example, it's a dual POV or dual first POV, steamy, open door, such and such, like all those kinds of things. I might just put in a sentence at the bottom of the blurb to make it really clear to readers what kind of tropes and things we're hitting. But it's really, really, really short. The blurb should do the heavy lifting in terms of making it clear. Like you say with the dark academia, it's set at a university and then there's a murder. Like that should all make it really obvious what genre people are getting into.
Yeah, so it's a balance there, really.
Yeah, definitely. And I think your Amazon keywords and categories play a pretty important part in getting people there as well. That would be kind of the place I think to focus on rather than trying to do a keyword dump into your poor old blurb.
Yeah, no, fair enough. How you said that obviously authors tend to really not like writing blurbs. How good do authors tend to be at writing blurbs in your experience?
It's a tricky one to answer because I think I only deal with the ones who are struggling and who are like, hey, I've written this really bad blurb, please help me. So it would be easy for me to say, all authors are terrible at writing their blurbs. I think, whereas there'd be a whole bunch of other really good ones out there that I just don't know about. I wouldn't know that the author had written it, for example, kind of thing. So it's a bit of an impossible question to answer, but I will say that authors do face a unique set of challenges when they're approaching the blurb. The first being that, you've been in this book for months, years, possibly a decade, and it can be really hard to actually step back and know what will be essential for a new reader to know. So one of the big things that authors often struggle with is that they want to fit too much detail into the blurb because it's this inability to separate what is essential and what is like would be nice to put in if we had room kind of thing. So that's kind of the biggest challenge. The other thing is also that authors are, for the most part, long form writers. I consider myself a short form writer. I have plans to branch out into writing a book, but to me, that's a big challenge, a big new skill that I have to learn. And much the same way that for authors, learning to write a blurb is a whole new skill that is kind of the opposite of what you've been doing. You've been dumping huge amounts of words on the page, going through this, editing process and everything. And with blurbs, it's just got a completely different structure to your book. It's a completely different purpose to your book because it's, again, a piece of sales copy, not a piece of entertainment like your book is, or something that's informative or whatnot. So I think the thing that a lot of authors don't realize is that it's hard because it's a completely different skill, and they kind of beat themselves up and say, well, I've written this whole book, I know it so well, why can't I write 3 paragraphs on it? And it's because there's a formula to a successful book blurb, and there's an approach, and if you don't know that, then you're taking the long way around, and it's a lot harder and a lot more frustrating and a lot less effective in the end as well. So that would be kind of the main thing that I notice in terms of whether or not authors are good or bad. One thing that authors are really good at knowing is whether a blurb is sort of hitting the right points. And one of the things that I love about my job is that, the editing process for me with blurbs that I write for my clients is always highly collaborative. So I'll write a first draft and then send it over to them. And then I need to hear from them whether, a certain word choice feels a little bit off and and why it feels off. Does this sound too enthusiastic, or does this take away the character's agency a bit when actually they had a bit more control? All of those kinds of things are points that authors are really good at picking up on in their own book as a general rule, and are able to kind of provide me with even more detail and layers that I can then incorporate into, the next edit of the blurb. generally speaking, the blurbs that I write don't undergo heavy editing, but it's that nuance that's so important, and that's something that authors are actually really good at picking up on. But it can be really difficult to do it all on your own.
Yeah, I get that. And how much information do you need from an author to create this blurb? Because I've heard you say that you don't go ahead and read the whole book, and that you kind of just need to know
No.
some basic information about the story. So what do you generally ask authors for at the outset?
So I experimented with this a bit, and I actually have the same information form that I used to use on Fiverr. And what you'll find is with some blurb writers, they'll go for a more formal approach where they're like, who's the antagonist, who's the protagonist, what's their character growth, what's their main pain point, like all that kind of stuff. For me, I find that gives too piecemeal a picture for me. Like, I don't get the vibe of the book from that. It starts to sound too like scientific, and blurb writing treads this funny kind of line between a science and an art. Like, there's definitely elements there that are a framework and a formula, but there's a lot of creativity in it as well. So my form is really simple. I ask, basic things like the title, the subtitle, if it's part of a series, all that kind of stuff. Who's your target audience? If you know who your target audience is, that's really helpful. But then the main part of it is explain your book to me in just like bullet points, or just like a word vomit type summary. And generally speaking, most authors give me between 500 to 2,000 words. And the sweet spot I find is about 1,000 words. When it's that kind of, and you have like, they have to tell me everything, like spoilers and all, like the whole story, just break it down. Like, this happens, then this happens, then this happens. Kind of like we're sitting down and having a conversation about it. Tell me what your characters look like, that sort of thing. And what I kind of am able to glean from that is that the natural sort of themes in the story tend to come out organically when authors have just kind of sat down and just explained the story. And I'm like, oh, and sometimes it also allows me to sometimes see themes that the author hasn't clocked onto as well. Like, I've said to authors, like, oh, I'm seeing this theme of, control coming through for the main character. I'm like, oh my gosh, I hadn't thought of it that way. But yes, that's really, really true. That's really important to them. So it kind of, rather than putting them in boxes, like, you must tell me what the character's, growth arc is, by just telling me what happens in the story in a really casual way, I'm able to go through and kind of make my own deductions and then bounce them off, you as the author, to see if that's kind of ringing true. And it means that, like, occasionally there are small inaccuracies, but they're usually a really easy fix, because the like I say, the overall theme and direction of the story are usually really clear from that kind of a synopsis. In fact, when people give me, I had an author once, sort of, I worked with them before, and this time around they were like, I'm going to just give you a chapter summary. And I was like, okay. They're like, I don't have much time, I'm just gonna give you a chapter summary. And it didn't work, because the chapter summary was too, I'm trying to think what the right word is. It didn't sort of have the heart and soul of the book. It was a bit perfunctory. It was kind of like, this happens, this happens, this happens. There was no kind of motive. So normally when authors are telling me, they're like, then so-and-so have a fight because so-and-so thinks this and the other person thinks this. And that just didn't come across in a chapter by chapter summary, which might be great if you're querying or whatever else, for if that's what an editor wants or an agent. But for the blurb, it really didn't work, and it was quite funny, and we had a laugh about it. And the author was like, you're definitely going to have to share this story, that, authors just have to do things the way that you said the first time around, because it works so much better. Because we ended up having to go back to the original plan. I'm always willing to give it a go, but I ended up saying to them, I was like, yeah, we actually need to go back and do it my way. Sorry. You're going to have to sit down and give me that little, and look, and not all authors like to work that way. So that's totally cool. I think it's important for people to know up front that that's how I work. Other people just kind of want to throw their manuscript at a blurb writer. But for me, I'm not the target audience of every single book. So for me to sit down and read, and I write blurbs for all genres. I love the variety that comes with that. But like, I'm not necessarily going to get the same experience from reading your book as your target readership is. So if you just tell me about your book, then I'm able to go, all right, these are the points that I need to sell. So it's a different kind of way of looking at it, but one that I found is super successful and like just makes it so much easier for everyone involved.
When you're looking at fiction, it's interesting because you said that, rather than just having the this happens, this happens, this happens, you want to know sort of why and the behind the scenes, and that like all that
Yeah.
juicy internal turmoil and conflict, that's what, like, especially in fiction, what makes the book so great. And I imagine this is probably different depending on what kind of book it is, what kind of genre you're writing in. But are you really focusing on sort of those internal struggles that the character has, or and does this differ for different genres? Say in crime, I imagine you might be more looking at what happened, and maybe the why it happened is part of the mystery.
Yeah, so it's interesting. I always say to authors that readers don't care about your characters yet, which sounds really harsh. And obviously, if they're on to book 2, 3, or 4 in a series, that's slightly different. They're acquainted with characters. But let's just say it's a standalone or the first book in a series. We're not connected with your characters yet. And trying to build rapport with characters within 150 to 200 words, which is kind of our sweet spot for a book description, is almost impossible, to the extent that people might be like, oh, I care if they get their heart broken. But they will care if they can see the character in a situation that they find relatable, or that they could sort of imagine themselves being in and needing to work their way out of. So what I suggest is that, and this is trickier for romance writers where all of the stakes generally tend to be quite emotional, I tend to say focus on what's happening sort of physically, and what are the concrete things that are actually happening, because this is what we can more instantly relate to. So a good example of this is, again, like if we say in romance, where if you're raising the stakes to the point of like, can so-and-so ever love again? That's something that the reader's going to be like, I don't know this character, so yeah, maybe not. And if you get diehard romance fans who are all about that particular trope, then sure, they'll jump in. But there could be a great deal of people who would love your story, but they just don't care enough about your character yet, and you haven't given them a reason to care about the circumstances that they're in. So then they're just going to miss out on your story, which would be a great shame. So by contrast, if you are asking your audience a question like, can a broken heart ever love again? All of a sudden, we're kind of drawn into the story. And rather than making it all about the character and the situation they're in, we're actually thinking like, oh, actually, maybe I've been in that situation, or maybe I could imagine being in that situation. And just kind of like drawing the reader into those more, I suppose, the bigger picture. So it's, rather than making it just about that character's heart, it's about everyone's heart in a sense. And so I will always focus on what's actually happening to the character. Do they have to move? Do they change jobs? Do they, like, what's happening physically around them? But then I link that to what's going on internally. It's just that the internal takes a slight backseat in the blurb because it's so much harder to convey. People are complex, and trying to get across the complexities of your character in a blurb is just super tough. You basically get to pick one aspect of them to kind of showcase or focus on. So for example, if I can see that a character's arc has been that, they struggle with control and like letting go and going with the flow, then that's going to be the one kind of internal thing that I focus on through that blurb, and I link it to things that are actually happening. Are they freaking out because they've lost their job? Are they freaking out because, their friends moved away? That's kind of the thread that goes all the way through, rather than focusing the whole time on blah blah has a problem with control and actually stating it. I'm just going to try to weave that through the actual circumstances that are happening to them, because then readers who pick that up, read those circumstances, relate or don't relate. Remember, we're not trying to attract everybody, and can see the way the character is starting to interact with those circumstances, and will get interested enough to go on that journey with them. But we can't assume that our characters are the most interesting people in the world in 150 words. It's too hard. It's too big a job to do, and if we try to do it, tends to come across as kind of shallow and disingenuous in a way. It's just kind of unrealistic. So people latch onto circumstances.
Interesting. Yeah, because so much of, especially novel writing, is about that internal stuff. Yeah, that's fascinating how you take that and like translate it into something that will hopefully convince the right people to read the book.
It's funny because even the most sort of emotion focused story is still always linked to something physical that's happening around them, whether it's like, somebody dies or the scenery changes in some way. There's always that physical link. And I think as the novelist, if you're really inside your character's heads the whole time, that's probably been your focus. But if you kind of are able to take that little step back and look at what's actually happening around them and paint the situation for readers, those circumstances, that is going to make it just seem so much more realistic.
Yeah, it's very true. I guess the other struggle is like knowing how much to include in the blurb as well, because you want to hook your reader in, but also you don't want to give too much away. But then that all this exciting stuff happens like maybe after the 25% mark of the story. And like how far, if we're looking at sort of story structure with where, you're starting off with an inciting incident and, you're moving up to like at the midpoint, there's something that changes and takes the character on a new trajectory. Like how far through the novel would you sort of tease at?
It's a tricky one because every novel has a slightly different trajectory. And I do tend to, I know that some blurb advice is like, only talk about what happens in the first 50 pages, which is ridiculous because what if you've written a 5,000 word novella or a 50,000 word book? They're going to be totally different. The first 50 pages are totally different in both of those examples. So I do tend to focus on the first third of the book, that kind of not necessarily consciously, but if I kind of step back and look at it, that tends to be what I'm focusing on. Definitely we need to, the way that I kind of roughly structure, let's say a fiction blurb would be, in the first paragraph, we're sort of setting up where the character is at the start of the story. And this is something that people sometimes get wrong because they'll put a whole bunch of backstory in. And the problem is if you put backstory in, people assume what's in the blurb is in the book. So if you put backstory in, then they're going to be expecting to read that backstory and they're going to be confused when they open your book, and that's not what's actually happening. So what you need to do is make sure that first of all, you set up where your main character is at the very start. And then if you need the context of some backstory, you weave that in as we move forward, but only as it is relevant to us understanding where the character is now. Anything else we don't need. Paragraph 2 tends to be where I introduce the inciting incident. Like, what is it that shakes your character up, propels them out of their current situation, and forces them to go on this journey, their quest, their arc, whatever's happening. Sometimes that means introducing, a secondary character, another plot point to kind of flesh out what's happening to this character. But certainly by paragraph 2, we should understand what their main journey is going to be, I guess, in the book. And then paragraph 3 is often where, people freak out and they're like, well, I can't put any spoilers in, so I just have to be really vague and mysterious and just end it there. What you actually have to do is keep your spoilers in the forefront of your mind as you write your blurb, because you need to foreshadow them, obviously without giving them away. We don't put spoilers in the blurb. But if you have very vague stakes, then we have no idea what kind of spoilers to expect. And that's actually, it's a funny one. Like, blurbs are about setting a reader's expectations up correctly so they read your book and they're super satisfied. They're like, yes, this is the ride that I signed up for. So in the third paragraph, as we raise the stakes, we want to be, so for example, sometimes people will say things like, then a secret is revealed and everything changes. We don't know what everything is. We don't know what kind of secret. Is the secret that, your auntie murdered someone, or is it simply that, you're adopted? Like, what's going on for the main character? How serious is it? How life-changing? Now, we don't have to actually reveal the secret, but perhaps it's like, you could say, when a sinister secret is revealed, so-and-so, questions their whole family. That would give an indicator of like, yes, your auntie is a murderer. But if it's more like that personal, been adopted, or there's a long lost twin or something like that, then it's maybe a family revelation comes to light. The tone is just different. And so with one, we're expecting something dark and full on. And with the other, we're like, well, there's something kind of pretty serious going on, but we're not expecting, guns and whatever else. So the tone of how you kind of raise those stakes is so important, and very often I think overlooked. In that third paragraph, people tend to just kind of go all out with questions. I have a very complex relationship with questions. I don't love questions at the end of blurb. they're often a very lazy, ineffective way to raise the stakes. And I totally understand why people do them, because on the face of it, they sound exciting, but they very rarely actually draw readers in, unless it's a question the reader can answer. So if you're there asking, will so-and-so crack the code before it's too late? The reader goes, I will read the book, maybe, to find out. That's all. Whereas if you are asking a question that the reader could conceivably answer, what would happen in a world where this ceases to exist? That's something that readers can kind of get a bit more engaged with and sort of go, wow, okay, what would that look like? Oh, this book is going to kind of show me one possibility. Let's read it and find out. It's just kind of a different type of engagement. I do tend to steer clear of questions at the end of blurbs. I use them sometimes. They're not illegal. But I often challenge authors to reword their questions as statements and see if it works better, because it very, very often does. I actually think we might have got the whole questions things from movie trailers. Movie trailers have that very kind of dramatic can so-and-so find X before this happens? So I don't know if that's where it's come from, but yeah, reword it as a statement and see if it's stronger.
I was going to ask about film trailers, actually, because I've heard blurbs be compared with film trailers, and on the one hand, I agree, but also there are an awful lot of film trailers where I'll watch it, and I don't know if this is just me, but the fact that I'm very sort of familiar with story structure and the kind of story beats that you would expect in a typical film, but I often feel like I watch a film trailer and I go, well, I basically don't need to see the film now. I'm sure I can tell you what the plot of this thing is, and like, what's the point? Whereas there are other trailers where like it's really mysterious and I don't really know what's going on, but I'm so much more intrigued. And then, if you're watching on YouTube, you scroll down and people are like, I have no idea what this film is about, or people going, love the vibes, no idea what the plot is. So I imagine that it's similar, but maybe, I don't know. Do you think the films have to give more away in the trailer than books do in the blurb?
No, it's a pet peeve of mine. I agree with you. I'll watch trailers and be like, well, I've seen... Actually, the worst is when they put all of the funny scenes in the trailer, so you think it's a really funny film.
Yeah,
and then you watch the film and you're like, those 3 jokes are it. Like, that was it. And you'll actually get blurbs that do a similar thing where they'll kind of indicate one thing, like, oh, this book is going to be really fast paced, and then it's not, or this book is going to be all about this particular event and it's actually something else. It's quite easy to be misleading in the short form, which is something we have to be really careful about. But I think with films, they're just marketed so differently. In a sense, they're really not comparable, because you'll see, for example, the Barbie trailer, which I'm going to write my email about today to my list, was so mysterious. I was like, I don't know what to expect from this at all. The music from, what is it, Space Odyssey was playing in there, and I'm like, what is going on? I have no idea. But then the marketing around that, they've got the actors doing interviews, there's a whole lot of visual aspects to movie trailers as well. So even if we're totally confused, there's a visual aspect we can look at and go, well, this looks interesting. There's a music aspect, there's certain actors that we might want to see in a film. There's a whole lot of things that kind of come together. And we also tend to see movie marketing over and over and over and over again. They spend the big bucks to get it in front of us a lot of times and kind of come at it from a whole lot of different angles. Whereas with books, if someone's in a bookstore and they pick up your book and, you're not Stephen King or whatever, and they have no idea who you are, like, you kind of have that one chance to get them interested in your story. You can't afford to give them nothing or everything. Otherwise, they're going to be like, why am I still here? So I think with books, it's about... So the thing with book blurbs is they have their own beginning, middle, and end. And this is something I think movie trailers tend not to do either. They kind of tend to be a bit piecemeal, and they'll jump all over the place, and you don't necessarily... Either you see the entire plot or you see nothing. With book blurbs, your book has a beginning, middle, and end. Your book blurb has a different beginning, middle, and end, because obviously you're not including your spoilers. So, and what will very often happen is that things are in a slightly different order. You don't necessarily follow every single incident in your book, so you can't put all of them in, so you have to reconstruct the narrative slightly. And I think that structure is something that's really, really important in getting the right parts of the story across. So authors are always really concerned about, like, how much do I give away? But actually, what we need to look at is, what does the reader have to know? And once you focus on that, like, what do they absolutely have to know to get interested in your story? It's kind of like the difference between like this lack mindset and a more kind of growth mindset. It's like, what do we include rather than what can't we include? And when you sort of flip that model, it's much easier to go through your book and go, well, that information needs to be in there because they need to understand this, and that information needs to go in there because they need to understand this, rather than constantly coming at from can't use that, can't use that, can't use that, that's a spoiler. It just has blurbs written that way have a very different feel.
I think you can feel that when you read something, and it's like you can feel that the author's sort of sitting there behind the scenes going like this. like I can't tell you, but mysteries are afoot.
Exactly. And I'm like, but what kind of mysteries? I need more before I commit.
Exactly, and to do with genre as well. Like, it's especially I read an awful lot of fantasy, and like that needs to be very clear in the blurb. Like, even if magic doesn't come into the story until later on down the road, if there's magic, the reader's going to need to know about it, because they're going to be really surprised if they get halfway through your book and suddenly, I don't know, a fairy godmother turns up or something, and
Oh yeah.
it completely subverts your expectations, unless that's what you're going for. And I mean, if you're writing literary fiction or something like that, then that might be your goal. But those genre expectations are really important. And obviously the cover is very important in communicating the genre as well, the kinds of categories that it's in on Amazon or in a bookshop. But the blurb is pretty jolly important, and it needs to hit those same notes that the genre and the cover is communicating. Otherwise, it's going to be super confusing.
And can I just say, fantasy blurbs are the hardest blurbs to write. Of all the blurbs that I write, they're always the hardest because the plot is so complex. And here's the thing. Plot doesn't actually sell your book. It's the characters and the way you've told the story that sell your book. So a lot of people will focus on plot for the blurb, but the plot of Star Wars is basically the same as Harry Potter in a lot of ways, and those two things are wildly different. And like, the more kind of pop culture you look at, the more you see. This is why we have tropes, right? We've got the how many enemies to lovers, romance books are there, but are they all the same? Absolutely not. So it's your particular characters and the way that you're telling your story that is so important. And with fantasy, authors tend to get quite bogged down in plot because they're complex, and there's councils and governments and sometimes different planets if we're in this fantasy sci-fi sort of genre. And in I was going to say normal fantasy. What, I don't know. I don't even know what normal fantasy is anymore. But there's world building. There's standard fantasy. I don't know. But like there's world building. There's countries. There's states. There's kingdoms. There's whole different societal hierarchies and things like that. So a kind of hack, if I can call it that I sort of have for writing fantasy blurbs is to make sure that I'm really focused on what the main character's one growth point or goal is. Like that one thing that they are learning as the book goes on, or the one thing that they have to get if it's kind of a quest situation. And then I make sure that the only other things that I tell the reader are only the things that are relevant to understanding how the character has to get there. So how that journey sort of, because otherwise you can go on so many different tangents. And I once had to write a blurb for a 9 POV fantasy book, and it was the hardest blurb I've ever written. We ended up mentioning 5 or 6 of the characters, which is, characters are kind of something you don't want to bombard a reader with. I tend to stick to a max of 3 names, and 2 is better because names are just a lot for readers to process. You have to sort of yeah, it's like meeting a whole bunch of people at once and you're like, I can't remember your name. Who are you? Who did you work for again? Like, it's a lot. And so that was a huge challenge, but we had to mention at least 5 of the people. Otherwise, it was not going to make sense. But because we had this central thread and we made sure that each of those characters were sometimes linked in pairs, so we gave them a context that was easier for readers to grab onto, it was doable and it was fine, but it was very, very challenging. And it took us quite a while to kind of get to the final version and go, right, this is all of the information that needs to be in there. And we absolutely have to mention this person and so on and so forth. But that I tend to just make sure that with fantasy, I have the central focus and the central theme at the forefront of everything, because it just helps you to eliminate whatever is not relevant to that particular arc. Because of course, everything in your book is exciting and awesome, but we just need to make sure we give the reader a coherent thread to hold on to so they can get interested enough to jump into it.
Yeah, and for fantasy, part of the joy of reading fantasy is exploring this new world and finding out what's happening. So I think
Yeah.
an example of this, to go back to film trailers, but there's a the trailer for the original the Golden Compass film, which not a great film. We have a lot of thoughts about that, but one of the things that, it might not even be the trailer, but I heard somebody point out that at the start of the film, and probably in the trailer as well, it kind of says to you that this is a world where there are armored bears and there are witches and there are, you know, animals that are like part of your soul, and it basically gives you a laundry list of all the amazing fantastical things that are in this film. It's like, you contrast that to the book, where, you know, we start off with talking about this character and her demon, and we're just going, what is a demon? There's no context there at all. And it's as we go on that we discover what's happening, and that's what makes that book so magical. You could say the same about the first Harry Potter book, for instance. Many stories are like that, where it's all about exploring that world. So if you give too much away, it's like, well, you've just taken away all the fun.
And also, a laundry list is just the worst way to learn about those things as well. Like, we're not, and that is something you got to be careful of in a blurb. Some blurbs read like a laundry list of things that happen. And what I try to really encourage people to do is to focus on context and connecting things. Those connections are so important because they kind of help readers to grasp things. Like, we know the way that humans remember things is by associating them with other things. So it's not to get too psychological with it, but if you actually give readers, for example, if you introduce Jane as the main character's sister, instantly, even if they don't remember Jane's name, they know there's a sister. So there's context there. Whereas if you just introduce her as a completely separate person, it's more work for the reader going, and how do they fit in? Like, what happens here? So it's about making sure that the reader can see a clear connection between everything and follow that path through to its logical conclusion. And of course, we leave them wanting more. It's not like the end conclusion, but it's so important that the blurb is just a fully contained story on its own that is not just throwing stuff at you. The other thing people often do when they're describing their main character is they'll kind of tell you who they are instead of showing you who they are. And that whole show don't tell thing really applies to blurbs as well. Like, nobody wants to read you telling me who your character is. Show me who they are through like the 2 or 3 actions that you can highlight in the blurb, and they'll just feel so much more real.
I wonder what you think about these social media graphics that we're seeing a lot of, which has the cover in the middle and then the little arrows with all the tropes that are in the story. Yes, I think that's sort of a little bit like a laundry list, but I mean, in some ways I kind of love them because I can see immediately, these are the sort of the key things I'm going to get from this book. But in some way they're quite reductive, and in some ways they maybe are giving away more than they should. I don't know. What are your thoughts on those?
I think they're really savvy if you know, again, like in romance, that your audience are trope readers. I'm not,
and I think that's where it comes from.
I'll out myself as a non-trope reader right here, because I'm just like, I don't want to know. Like, I'm not saying that I dislike all tropes. I don't mind that, but I don't want to know what they are before I go into the book. I'm not sitting here like, I want an enemies to lovers read, or I want it, like, I'm just like, this book looks interesting. Let's go. That's kind of the way that I choose to read. But a lot of people are trope readers. A lot of people are looking for that, the comfort of their favorite tropes, which is a perfectly legitimate way to choose your next read. And if you know that that's the way that your audience is selecting things, then I think that's a really smart way to market. Does it replace a blurb? Absolutely not, because look,
no.
some people are going to go, oh, I need a new such and such book. I'm going to just buy it. Others are going to go, okay, I might like this one. Tell me more. So your blurb has to be ready and waiting for those people who are on the fence, so that they can either invite them in or just be like, no, this is not the book for you. We don't want you in your 1-star review. Goodbye.
Yeah, that's super interesting, especially like a trope like enemies to lovers, which in some ways, those 3 words gives you the framework of what the book is going to be. Like, it basically tells you at the beginning they hate each other, and then they're going to go through some stuff together, and at the end they're going to end up together. And
yes,
in some ways, especially in romance, like you know from the beginning, like these 2 characters are at odds, but because we know it's a romance book, we expect that they will end up together, because apparently fighting equals sexual tension. But
exactly.
and the same with like friends to lovers. You know exactly what that trajectory is going to be, and I think in some genres you're looking for that. But for instance, if you're in a fantasy book, take something like the ubiquitous Fourth Wing at the moment. If you're telling me that it's enemies to lovers, then you're actually, it's taking away from a lot of that that plot development in some ways. So yeah,
and it
but
also
it depends if you're reading it as fantasy or as romance. I don't know.
And then Fourth Wing is a really interesting example as well, because I haven't read it, full disclosure. I have read the blurb, and I thought the blurb was fantastic. I was like, this is such a great blurb. And then I started reading more about the book and about how much romance is in there and how much of it is relationship, and people's main complaints. Most of the complaints are coming from fantasy readers who are like, what, this is not what I signed up for. And when I read the blurb, I was like, this is a straight fantasy book. There might be a little bit of romance in there, but it's a straight fantasy book. Whereas what I'm hearing, and again, this is what I'm hearing, not my own personal experience in the book, but is that it's more of a romance book set in a fantasy world, and that the romance is a much bigger part of it, and that fantasy readers aren't here for it, basically. And I think that's a really great example of a potentially quite misleading blurb. Now, in some ways, that doesn't matter, because Fourth Wing achieved such virality that people are going to just jump in and read it without ever having read the blurb. But the blurb should still be there to clarify for people, say like me, who genuinely looked up Fourth Wing and was like, this might be something I like, and then heard more about it and went, no, not really. But the blurb should have been there to make that clear to me. Otherwise, the way it's been marketed is just kind of as a straight fantasy book, which, yeah, I'm hearing is not the case.
Yeah, it's. I have a lot of thoughts about that. We could go down a whole rabbit hole. But I did want to ask you about kind of the hook of the blurb, because in some ways that's the most important part. It's like that first couple of seconds of an Instagram reel or something. It's what makes your reader go, oh, I want to read beyond this. Do you have any advice for creating a hook that is, because you said that like the first paragraph of the blurb is sort of setting up what the character's state is at the beginning of the book, but that might not necessarily be so interesting to a reader. So especially if it's, we know that this character is going to be thrown into a fantasy world, but the first paragraph is about them living their boring normal life. So how do you how do you take a hook? How do you hook a reader? The $1 million question.
It's a tricky one. It's a tricky one. So I mean, in my book Blurb Magic course, I have 3 hook formulas that I teach authors that are a really great place to kind of start. And then I did a whole masterclass just on hooks because there's just so many other ways to do them. Like if you want to delve in, there's just a myriad of ways to do them. What I think is really interesting at the moment is that trad publishing is moving away from the traditional hook. So just to clarify for anyone who doesn't know, the hook is usually a single sentence, sometimes 2, sometimes 3 really short statements. That is like bolded or otherwise kind of highlighted in a different font or a different font size or color at the top of your blurb. And it's part of your blurb, but it also operates completely independently from your blurb. So one of my pet peeves is when people do a hook that is almost just like the first line of their blurb. So if you skipped the hook, if you were like, I'm going to go straight to the blurb because I know I'm interested, it doesn't make sense without having read that first line. I think I saw like a sci-fi one that was something about like, the planet X is in danger because blah. Like that was the hook. And then the first paragraph assumed you'd read the hook. And I hadn't. I'm a sucker for just jumping straight into like, yep, I'm interested. Show me the first paragraph. And then went, what planet are you talking about? I'm confused. I have to go back. So it should operate, a good hook should operate completely independently. And it should give the reader the flavor of your book in as few words as possible. So I don't know, like we take a fantasy about, a girl who finds out she's a witch and she has to use her powers to do whatever. Your hook could be, what would you do if you found out you were a witch? Like you could draw the reader in to make them kind of go, because the main character's main dilemma is, do I do anything with this power or don't I, kind of thing. So, that hook operates completely independently from the rest of the story told in the blurb, but it does draw the reader in straight away into the main dilemma, what's going on for the main character and what kind of atmosphere. Plus, you're mentioning witch in the hook. They know what kind of book it is. It's a witchy book, like straight up. So that is kind of how a hook works. Now, a question can work well as a hook, but I think the real secret of a great hook is some kind of surprise, twist, or juxtaposition. Like contrasting a couple of things is really, really effective for a hook. Asking, I'm just trying to think. All of the hooks that I've ever written have now flown out of my mind. But essentially what you want to do, it's especially important for Amazon, by the way, as well. So when people click into your Amazon listing, they can only see a few lines of your book description. If that is a review or otherwise not blurb related stuff, or it's just the first kind of paragraph of your blurb, which should still be interesting, but is not necessarily like clickbait, then you risk like readers not actually clicking the read more thing, because Amazon won't show them the whole description on mobile if you got to click read more. So the hook should be interesting enough that they're like, whoa, hang on, what's going on here? I need to click read more and read the rest of the blurb. So hooks are so kind of individual. It's really hard to say exactly what the magic element is. I've done rhyming hooks for fantasy books, like a little couplet almost, which I love doing. I've done that for like two books. It's not something you want to overdo, but like books that have like a prophecy in them, or what was the one that I did about like a wheel turning, the seasons are changing kind of thing. Anything like that can really work with this whimsical sort of little rhyming hook. Others are, a question that invites the reader into the world. And the other way I do it is, that's the one that I was thinking of. There's like a romance one where it was kind of like, what was the first bit? It was something like, he's ready, to move on. And then her part was, she's ready to ruin his life. Something like that. Well, it was sort of just like juxtaposing these two characters, and it kind of makes you laugh and go like, whoa, okay, hold up. They're not at all on the same page. What's going to happen here? That kind of thing can really sort of grab a reader. And notice I'm not using any character names. I'm not introducing anyone. I'm not actually introducing any plot points in the hook. We want the hook to be instantly digestible. It has to make sense all on its own, and just more than anything else, convey the atmosphere of your book. So readers get like this feeling and they're like, oh, yeah, it's kind of like the opening credits of a film. You're just like, oh yeah, I like the vibe of this. This is cool. I'm liking the music. I'm liking the cinematography. The font of the title looks like a genre I'm interested in. Like that, all of that kind of stuff you want to sort of convey in a hook. It's that feeling. And I think a lot of look, it's the trickiest part of the hook. It takes me like 70% of my blurb writing time to write the hook, and the other 30% is writing the rest of the blurb. So it's the part that I spend the longest time on. And that's why I sort of broke it down to those 3 simple formulas in my course, because I was like, these are the 3 ways that it's kind of most sort of foolproof to do it. But there's honestly just like endless ways to do it when it comes down to it. Interestingly, I'm noticing a trend in trad publishing to move away from these traditional hooks in favor of either, you know, the number 1 best-selling author so-and-so comes back with a novel about love and loss, like that kind of thing, which to me is like, snore, I'm not interested. I think it's lazy. I think it's lazy marketing. I think the authors deserve better. And also, sometimes they just don't have a hook at all, and they kind of just plunge straight into the blurb, which, again, I actually read an interview with another freelance blurb writer recently who noted the same thing, and he's of the same opinion as me, is that it's just lazy marketing. They're pumping out so many books. They don't have the time or the resources to actually sit down and write a really good hook, which is where indie authors have a really exciting edge, I think. If you're willing to put in the time or commission someone, if that's your style, like, then you can actually have this really eye-catching blurb that the trad publishers just aren't going for, because they can afford to throw money at influencers and TikTok and whatever else they're doing in their marketing. And yes, it's really stupid to have a weak link in your marketing puzzle, if you will. But as indie authors, you know, you get to make those decisions yourself and actually stand out from those people who aren't bothering with those elements because they're too caught up in the latest marketing trends, which I think is exciting and heartening. Even if you're finding hook writing really difficult, it is difficult, but it's really, really worth it.
Fascinating. Yeah, I think that's probably a good place to almost wrap up. I do have one last question for you. So are you familiar with The Name of the Wind by Patrick Rothfuss?
I've heard of it. I haven't read it.
Okay, I'm interested to hear your thoughts on this blurb, because I was looking through. I don't have a huge number of fiction titles here with me at the moment, but this is one of my favorites of all time. I read the blurb and thought, on one hand, it kind of doesn't tell me much, and on the other hand, it tells me quite a bit. So I'm just going to read it to you. I have stolen princesses back from sleeping barrow kings. I burned down the town of Trebon. I have spent the night with Felurian and left with both my sanity and my life. I was expelled from the university at a younger age than most people are allowed in. I tread paths by moonlight that others fear to speak of during day. I have talked to gods, loved women, and written songs that make the minstrels weep. My name is Kvothe. You may have heard of me.
Interesting. So you've read the book, I assume.
Yeah.
Do you feel like that's an accurate, like, was that enough information for you? Is there anything else that you feel readers should know before going in?
And the reason I picked this up was because of recommendations, not because of the blurb. So the thing is, so this is a quote directly from the book, and the way it's told from the perspective of the main character, but he's retelling his life as it's, you know, in the past, so like this previous version of himself. And so that's kind of how he starts off his story when he's telling it to this other character. But I mean, to me, it gives me fantasy. It tells me a bit about this character that it's kind of it's a notorious character that has done many things in this fantastical world. Like the university kind of stands out to me as being having been expelled from the university at a younger age than most people are allowed in. It tells you quite a bit, but also not very much at all. So yeah, it would be interesting.
And I think I tired a little bit of all of the I statements. It started to feel like a trivia night, like, who am I?
Yeah.
Question. Like that kind of, I was born in such and such, who am I? That's sort of how it started to feel to me. And I have very mixed feelings about blurbs that are just basically pulled straight from the text, because when you get to that part of the text, it's spoiled for you. Like, that's the other thing. I'm like, then you get there and you're like, oh, I've read this. This is on the back of the book kind of thing.
Yeah.
I actually read a book recently, totally different genres, nonfiction. I can't remember the author now, The Psychology of Money. And I was reading the opening, like I thought the blurb was really good. And as I was reading the introduction, it was just like that paragraph was part of the blurb, that paragraph was part. And I was it kind of bothered my reading experience a little bit, because I was like, but I've read that. I wanted to hear it in different words. So that kind of, I don't know that that's going to ruin your sales if you do that. But for me, it's a bit of a pet peeve and I wouldn't recommend it. I also think, like, my question is, yes, if you're a diehard fantasy reader, that probably sounds really exciting. You got it on recommendation. So, that's kind of what propelled you into the book. If we're just coming to the book with nothing else except the cover and the blurb, I don't think it's enough to give me an indicator of what kind of fantasy book it is. Are we talking a quest here? Are we talking... I just don't know. I have no idea which kind of direction it's going to go. And if I'm in the mood for a book that's just going to surprise me, then great. But I don't think many readers tend to buy on that amount of information. It's sort of like, especially with people wanting to know tropes and things like that, I feel like people really want a clear idea of what they're in for. And I mean, there's the whole trigger warnings conversation as well, and content warnings. More and more readers are kind of demanding to know what they're in for. And so I think it's always a tricky line to tread, but I would probably call that a lazy blurb. It's not terrible. It's not terrible. And I think it would grab plenty of the right people, but I think it would also miss a bunch of the right people too. And to me, that's always kind of a bit sad. I'm like, what if there were these other people? Like, for example, I'm not generally a high fantasy reader, but I do enjoy fantasy. I can't tell from that blurb whether that's a fantasy I would be interested in or not. It sounds interesting. It actually almost like, and maybe I've written too many kind of dark romance blurbs as well. It kind of gave me sexy vibes as well, like just a bit. There's something kind of dark, romancy about it, and I'm assuming that's incorrect. I don't know, but like, I don't know. That's the whole point. I don't know. So to me, it's a bit too vague. On the plus side, it does take us through some nice elements of the world building. So we kind of do get a bit of a picture of what kind of world we're in. I just wanted to know a little bit more about it. For example, I just kind of want to know, actually, I'm just trying to find the blurb. The blurb for The Murder Rule by Dervla McTiernan is amazing. I will pull it up on my phone here. And it's actually a good example of a similar style of blurb. Where are we? Because it's written in first person as well. And I use this as an example all the time. So it says, I'll just pop in here. Call the murder rule. So the blurb is, first rule, make them like you. Oh, my blurb disappeared. Second rule, make them need you. Third rule, make them pay. And then kind of goes into, she says, they think I'm a young, idealistic law student, that I'm passionate about reforming a corrupt and brutal system. They think I'm working hard to impress them. And then the end of the blurb is basically like, they're not, I'm going to end them all. So you kind of know which direction the story is going to go. You know that she's working to bring people down. And I guess that's what I wanted from this blurb. Rather than just, you may have heard of me, I want to know what it is they've done or are about to do. Just
there's no sense of
and so
the
maybe
direction.
It would just be... Yeah, so maybe it would just be a question of having a really small tweak to that to give us a hint of direction, and then ending with, my name is, you may have heard of me. That's really cool. I actually like that bit a lot. But because I don't know what you're about to do or what you did do that I'm here reading about, I'm struggling to commit.
And because you haven't heard of him. It works within the story because presumably the characters have heard of this person, but in the blurb we haven't. Yeah, I think it's...
Exactly.
I was really interested to look at this one because it has all these keywords in there that are sort of key to the story. You've got the town of Trebon, you've got somebody called Felurian, and talk to gods, and there are all these different things, and it's very indicative of what the writing style is like as well. And that's one of the main sort of draw cards of this book, is that it's got very a very sort of poetic prose. So I think maybe the publisher thought that that was one of the really important things to include in the blurb, and that it was best to take something from the story itself. But this was published in 2007, so I would be interested to see how they, like, if this was published today, how they might do that differently.
Yeah, and books sometimes go through multiple versions of blurbs as well.
It may have changed since they're in as
had
well.
An interesting discussion. Well, exactly. We had an interesting discussion about the blurb for Flock by Kate Stewart, because a follower actually sent it to me and went, "This book is so popular and like it's apparently great, but the blurb is really terrible." And it was a pretty dodge first person blurb. But what was really interesting is that on like the Amazon US, because I could only see it on Amazon Australia, they'd gone with an amazing blurb. It was like a third person, highly professional, like, and I assumed they had kind of changed it. Now it went viral, so a lot of people probably were just not reading the blurb as well. But I thought it was really interesting that there were these two versions. And, you know, the book has been highly successful. So obviously the bad blurb maybe didn't hurt it that much because it took off on social media. And when books take off on social media, they very often take off on quotes, aesthetic reels, that kind of thing. It's kind of a whole different way of selling the book, in which case a lot of people jump in and aren't interested. But I thought it was just like chalk and cheese with the two blurbs. I read the second one. I was like, wow, okay, this is amazing. I get what this story's about now. And then the other one was kind of like, I just wasn't sure what was going on at all. And yeah, so obviously books do go through different blurb iterations as well. And I think that's fascinating. And I mean, I always use examples of real life books in my courses and things like that. And I know some people message me sometimes, they're like, oh my gosh, I would feel so bad if you used my blurb as like an example of a bad blurb. But I always say, I'm like, honestly, if any of these authors ever like I only ever choose successful books for a start. Just to, like, I'm not going to pick on indie authors with a terrible blurb ever. But also, like, if any of the authors that I've used blurbs as examples for in my courses reach out to me, I'll be like, I'll write your blurb again for you for free because I want you to have a good blurb. But I just think it's really interesting to see the kind of range of things that are out there. And, you know, there's so many pieces to the book marketing puzzle. A blurb can't fix everything magically, and also it's not necessarily going to ruin everything magically, but certainly if you are, you know, running Amazon ads and you're getting great click-through but very poor conversion, the next thing to look at is the blurb. Like, that's the next logical thing. You've got a great cover, you're showing up in searches, but if people aren't buying, it's probably the blurb. If you go viral, people probably aren't going to care about the blurb as much. So it's a really important piece of the puzzle, but as always, it's really difficult to kind of bring it down to just one thing. My philosophy is just always make every single part of your book marketing strategy as strong as possible, and don't necessarily look to trad publishers for what to do because they have just the budget to focus on other things. And from my perspective, it looks like blurbs are being less prioritized. Look to successful indie authors, preferably not viral ones, so you can kind of get a handle on who's doing, you know, well, because they probably have a better blurb and cover and keywords and all that kind of thing. Viral is just a whole other creature of its own, and everyone jumps on board with that one. But a good place also to start is I have a free cheat sheet, which you can find at the link in my Instagram bio, or just go to anatomyofabookblurb.com. That just outlines fiction and nonfiction blurbs. So it kind of walks you through the formula that I briefly discussed in our chat, and you've got it on paper so you don't have to take a million notes. And I also go through the nonfiction formula too, which is super helpful. I know we focused a lot on fiction today, but I do both. And now would probably be a good time for me to mention that if you use the code HOLLY10, you can get 10% off any of my courses. Or if you want to try, I have a one-to-one blurb audit service or a custom blurb service. You can use that code for those as well. It doesn't work on my bundles because they're already discounted. But if you want to just try me out for one blurb or one blurb audit, it's a great place to start and a nice little discount for you as well.
Fantastic. And so where can people go to find you on the internet?
I'm usually on Instagram, so at BookBlurbMagic. So that's a great place to come and send me a message or inquire, follow along. I try to put up lots of sort of free advice and tips and examples and stuff up there as well. And you can also go to bookblurbmagic.com if you'd like to sort of explore the services and things as well.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for your time. That has been very informative, and I feel like I've learned an awful lot through this chat. So hopefully,
I'm glad
other people will as well.
Yay. Thanks so much for having me.